It is this parallelism that we find both in Leibniz and in Spinoza. In different forms, it is true, because of the unequal importance which they attach to extension. With Spinoza, the two terms thought and extension are placed, in principle at least, in the same rank. They are therefore two translations of one and the same original, or as Spinoza says, two attributes of one and the same substance, which we must call God. And these two translations, as also an infinity of others into languages which we do not, are called up and even forced into existence by the original, just as the essence of the circle is translated automatically, so to speak, both by a figure and by an equation. For Leibniz, on the contrary, extension is indeed still a translation, but it is thought that it is the original, and thought might dispense with translation, the translation being made only for us. In positing God, we necessarily posit also all the possible views of God, that is to say, the monads. But we can always imagine that a view has been taken from a point of view, and it is natural for an imperfect mind like ours to class views, qualitatively different according to the order and position of points of view, qualitatively identical, from which the views might have been taken. In reality, the points of view do not exist, for they are only views, each given in an indivisible block and representing in its own way the whole of reality, which is God. But we need to express the plurality of the views that are unlike each other by the multiplicity of the points of view that are exterior to each other. And we also need to symbolize the more or less close relationship between the views by the relative situation of the points of view to one another, their nearness or their distance, that is to say, by a magnitude. That is what Leibniz means when he says that space is the order of coexistence, that the perception of extension is a confused perception, that is to say, a perception relative to an imperfect mind, and that nothing exists but monads, expressing thereby that the real whole has no parts, but is repeated to infinity, each time integrally, though diversely, within itself, and that all these repetitions are complementary to each other. In just the same way, the visible relief of an object is equivalent to the whole set of stereoscopic views taken of it from all points, so that, instead of seeing in the relief a juxtaposition of solid parts, we might quite as well look upon it as made of a reciprocal complementarity of these whole views, each given in block, each indivisible, each different from all the others, and yet representative of the same thing. The whole, that is to say, God, is this very relief for Leibniz, and the monads are these complementary plane views. For that reason he defines God as the substance that has no point of view, or again, as the universal harmony, that is to say, the reciprocal complementarity of monads. In short, Leibniz differs from Spinoza in this, that he looks upon the universal mechanism as an aspect which reality takes for us, whereas Spinoza makes it of an aspect which reality takes for itself. It is true that, after having concentrated in God, the whole of the real, it became difficult for them to pass from God to things, from eternity to time. The difficulty was even much greater for these philosophers than in Aristotle or Plotinus. The God of Aristotle, indeed, had been obtained by the compression and reciprocal compenetration of the ideas that represent, in their finished state or in their culminating point, the changing things of the world. And the duration of things was juxtaposed to his eternity, of which it was only a weakening. But in the principle to which we are led by the consideration of universal mechanism, and which must serve as its substratum, it is not concepts or things, but laws or relations that are condensed. Now, a relation does not exist separately. A law connects changing terms and is immanent in what it governs. The principle in which all these relations are ultimately summed up, and which is the basis of the unity of nature, cannot therefore be transcended to sensible reality. It is immanent in it, and we must suppose that it is at once both in and out of time, gathered up in the unity of its substance, and yet condemned to wind it off in an endless chain. Rather than formulate so appalling a contradiction, the philosophers are necessarily led to sacrifice the weaker of the two terms, and to regard the temporal aspect of things as a mere illusion. Leibniz says so in explicit terms, for he makes of time as of space a confused perception. While the multiplicity of his monads expresses only the diversity of views taken of the whole, the history of an isolated monad seems to be hardly anything else than the manifold views that it can take of its own substance. So that time would consist in all the points of view that each monad can assume toward itself, as space consists in all the points of view that all monads can assume toward God. But the thought of Spinoza is much less clear, and this philosopher seems to have sought to establish, between eternity and that which has duration, the same difference as Aristotle made between essence and accidents, a most difficult undertaking. For the ule of Aristotle was no longer there to measure the distance and explain the passage from the essential to the accidental, Descartes having eliminated it forever. However that may be, the deeper we go into the Spinozistic conception of the inadequate, as related to the adequate, the more we feel ourselves moving in the direction of Aristotelianism, just as the Leibnizian monads, in proportion as they mark themselves out, the more clearly tend to approximate the intelligibles of Plotinus. The natural trend of these two philosophies brings them back to the conclusions of the ancient philosophy. To sum it up, the resemblances of this new metaphysic to that of the ancients arise from the fact that both suppose ready-made, the former above the sensible, the latter within the sensible, a science, one and complete, with which any reality that the sensible may contain is believed to coincide, for both reality as well as truth are integrally given in eternity. Both are opposed to the idea of a reality that creates itself gradually, that is, at bottom, to an absolute duration.